When you think of adventure games on the Super Nintendo, Brandish is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. It's an action RPG and dungeon crawler hybrid that I hadn't heard anyone really talk about much before I played it myself. What I did catch from people was that it was difficult and disorienting, and that many people that started it never bothered to see it through. It is unconventional in a couple of ways, but I decided to jump in without thinking too hard about it to see what it had in store, and I have no regrets for the experience that it gave to me. The backstory of Brandish is actually one of the most compelling that I've heard in my adventures through the SNES library so far. Prior to the game's beginning, the bored king of a prosperous and peaceful kingdom called Barimia decides that he wants more mightiness for himself. After hearing about an ultimate power being stowed away at the top of a nearby tower, he decides to find it at any cost. He mounts a search party, climbs the tower, and forces his way into a locked chamber with a dragon statue within. The statue comes to life in that moment, and after the king is refused the dragon's abilities, they face off in battle. The king is victorious, but as the dragon dies, his energy is released unto the king, transforming him into a horrible monster. The magic flows over the townspeople and their homes, and they too fall to a similar fate. A giant chasm opens in the earth, swallowing everyone deep within, and nobody from below is ever heard from again. The game picks up with the main character, a traveling swordsman named Varric, who finds himself standing at the edge of that large chasm in the ground after learning there's treasure to be found. He's also on the run from a bounty hunter, Alexis, who's accused him of murdering her mentor. While he's contemplating what might be down there, Alexis appears behind him and moves to challenge him to a fight. With no place to go, Varric begins to descend, and after some misfired magic, the entire place shakes and starts to crumble, throwing the two inside with no quick way to return to the surface. The adventure's purpose is to climb back up through floor after floor of challenging battle and confusing mazes, all while keeping a few steps ahead of your bounty hunter rival. Brandish begins with the odds stacked against it with a substantial learning curve in the control scheme. It feels nothing like any other top-down perspective games, with the biggest hurdle being that Varric's sprite doesn't turn to face different directions. Instead, he's always stuck facing forward, and you move the walls of the dungeon around him to change the way that he's facing. Imagine a 3D game like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D, but it's top-down and your surroundings only move 90 degrees instead of smoothly around your character. After a while, movement does become almost second nature, but at first, the biggest problem are the atrocious default control settings. In the configuration menu, one of the options is set to lateral. The D-pad on the controller typically moves your character around, but on this setting, if you push any direction, the walls around your character rotate instead. To get him to budge, you have to hold down one of the shoulder buttons while using the D-pad. I couldn't function like this and immediately switched the settings to rotate mode. This makes it so that using the D-pad alone moves Varric, and you flip the walls by also holding down one of the shoulder buttons. I don't know who in their right mind thought that needing to press several buttons at once just to move was a good idea. Even the manual thought that rotate was the better option, since it's highlighted in the picture of this menu screenshot. Lateral shouldn't have even been an option, never mind the default. Even still, I will admit that controlling a character like this took me some time to adapt to. It's like struggling with the fact that you can't jump in Bionic Commando after being able to in every single other platformer you've played until that point. I could see people with less patience than me throwing this game out the window, but Brandish has a lot more to offer beyond some easily solved control tribulations. A lot more. The gameplay unfurls as slowly as your main characters shuffle. Every step that you take adds a little more information to the map of each floor that you can access in the menu. It's safe to say that Brandish would be a lot less approachable without this auto-mapping feature, and I don't think I would have given it the time of day without it. One of the biggest complaints I hear about Brandish is that people get really disoriented because of moving the walls all the time. I also worried that this would be a problem for me, but having a map at my fingertips rectified much of that. The map has a compass to show you which way you're facing at all times, and the manual provides a few examples with legends to help decipher what you're looking at. If you do get lost, you'll have more than enough information to get back on track. Once you know the basics of getting around, the goal on each floor is always to find the next staircase on the climb up and out of the giant pit you've tumbled into, like some sort of reverse Diablo gameplay. Sometimes the stairs are in plain sight, but other times they're tucked away behind an obstacle or two. Much of the adventure sees you scouring for chests with special keys in them. They really weren't kidding when they said that you'd get to unlock the underworld, because finding and using all sorts of interestingly named keys is a huge part of advancing. Along with locked doors, you'll find some that only open with switches, or sometimes you'll have to do a bit of remodeling to move forward. You can use sledgehammers to break down crumbling walls, or even find false ones that can simply be walked through, like in Ultima 4 or The Legend of Zelda's Second Quest. It might seem overwhelming when you think of all these things standing between you and success all at once, but they're added to your experience incrementally. You first learn about crumbling walls for a few floors, and then they work in the pits that sometimes drop you down to a section of the floor that you couldn't reach previously below you. They slowly weave in the false walls, among other things, and the pacing for these additions is fantastic. They never throw too much at you at once and give you an opportunity to practice using the information that you're given. By endgame, when you're working through your list of skills to try, you've seen it all already and just have to go through the motions for the different obstacles. If the idea of slowly uncovering a whole floor just to go up some stairs and do it all over again seems like it would get old fast, you'll be happy to hear that there's a lot more to the gameplay than this. Along with enemy combat that I'll talk about shortly, there are a bunch of puzzles to work through as well. These can be physical problems to solve, involve riddles, or even take place over several floors. The game's wall rotation mechanic deepens the exploration aspect of these challenges by cleverly hiding switches or signs just out of plain sight, adding another layer of fun to the search. The majority of the puzzles felt inspired, and I say the majority of them because there are a few that could only be described as evil incarnate. I can't think of too many of them that ground my gameplay to a halt, but there was one area in particular that really tested my patience. It was in a stretch of the game called Dark Zone. Someone out there thought that it would be a good idea to fill a floor with invisible pits that send you back down to the floor below if you fall through them. Sure, you can see them if you open up your map and carefully maneuver around them all, but this isn't just one small section. It stretches over several floors, and one wrong move sends you all the way back to the beginning to try it over again from scratch. If there's one thing about Brandish that I'd consider egregious, it's this, but truthfully the rest of the puzzles were fun and brought much needed diversity and flavor to what would otherwise just be a very long walk. Thankfully, you're not always staring at the same brown walls and floors of the first area the entire time. As you ascend, you move through several stages that have different color palettes, music, and enemies to take down. The audio experience was also a huge highlight for me. It provided great ambience that was made up of some longer pieces that didn't get tiresome to listen to. The only downside is that none of them were particularly memorable. If you asked me to hum something from this game, I wouldn't be able to, but for what it's worth, it's great company for exploring, and I've listened to the soundtrack several times since finishing the game. Even more visual spice comes from the few and far between cutscenes that trigger when you find people that are lost or captured throughout your journey. Sometimes these encounters will go hand in hand with a little side quest, and other times people will just want to fight you, but there's a very distinct style to these interactions that I found charming. I wish there could have been more of this, but what was there was great. At fairly regular intervals, you'll find shops with some other poor people serving out their days in this pit of despair. What I loved about these places most was the welcoming atmosphere that they delivered. Shopkeepers and their storefronts were all distinct from one another, and they served as much more than a means to make purchases or sell excess inventory. There was always an option for conversation in the menu, and this was one of the very few ways to learn more about the sunken Virimia's history, the different areas of the ascent, or even as an avenue for some casual banter about how cool you were for not dying already. This was a very clever way to develop the narrative without the need for long-winded exposition or cutscenes, and you could take in as much or as little of this as you liked, since conversing was typically optional. As someone that really loves good world building, I really enjoyed taking the time to listen to what shop clerks had to say, but especially because they'd occasionally hint towards secrets. Mostly though, it was a nice break from the monotony of perpetual exploration. The only bizarre thing about the shops was how the items for sale were ridiculously expensive, especially at the beginning of the game. I'm talking well outside of my wallet's reach. You find money as you go, but it isn't really a necessity if you don't want to spend it. By the end of the game, I had amassed a small fortune, mostly because Brandish generously rewards exploring with chest after chest of weapons, potions, rings, and other items that you'd otherwise find at a hefty price on store shelves. I always gambled and held out to see if I could find what I needed versus spending the cash, and I can only think of a single time that I had to pay for something. A welcome feature that takes a lot of the purchase pressure off is not having to buy healing potions. You can recover HP anywhere at any time by holding the two shoulder buttons. The only downside is that time doesn't stop while you're healing, but you can usually find a quiet corner away from the action to do it safely. If I'd had to rely on buying healing items, between their price and how much distance there is between shops, I think the game would have been significantly more difficult. Not having to lug around a bunch of different recovery items all the time made tight inventory space feel reasonable rather than aggravating. You only start off with 12 slots, but there are ways to expand it down the line. As you play and discover your own personal tastes and which items you like to use, it gets easier to choose what to leave behind. Single slots can be conveniently stacked to pretty high numbers, so many of the grumblings I have about small inventories in other games are missing here. Another feature that I really appreciated was that you can drop stuff at any time. When you dump something, it doesn't disappear completely and instead becomes a little green jar that you can return and pick up again if you change your mind. As someone who's regretfully dropped an important item or two on a few quests, it's a huge relief that you're protected from judgment lapses or even grave errors in inventory management. I also really liked how the game treats the green jars as a subtle story point. In addition to appearing when you discard things, they're also described in the manual as items that other adventurers that came before you left behind. In this one small detail, they paint a picture of the scope of this place's impact on so many other people, and it's humbling to realize that you're only one on a long list of people that has traveled through these caverns. Enemies in Brandish come from all walks of evil. At the beginning of the game, you're dealing with slow, low-level enemies that are relatively easy to fight with melee combat, but as you get higher up in the quest, they get faster and more powerful, and become more difficult to fight hand-to-hand. One of the biggest challenges is that Varric can only move in 4 directions and can't attack diagonally. Some enemies don't follow that same rule set, and it does take a bit of finesse to get your movement and attack timing right depending on what you're up against. In terms of the armaments available, many of the things you'll find in chests are swords of different strengths and endurance. And yes, you heard that right. Some weapons have a finite number of uses before they permanently break. This kind of mechanic is usually a huge deterrent for me, but there are a few things here that help to ease the burden. The first is that you find so many swords that it doesn't really matter if you keep breaking them. It's very hard to run short on weapons, but if you do find yourself empty-handed, you can always attack enemies with your fists, so you're never really completely helpless. In fact, I spent almost the first 2 hours of the game thinking that I had a sword equipped, and unintentionally punched everything straight back to hell. It wasn't as effective as a weapon, but I survived just fine. Secondly, you'll find a lot of hardening potion, which restores the number of uses your weapon has. It's still a limited resource, but used wisely, it is possible to make your favorites last longer. Thirdly, you do eventually find weapons that don't break. The downside to these is that they're typically at a lower strength value than the finite use weapons that you'd find in the same area. I'm someone who doesn't like to micromanage things constantly and gravitated toward the unbreakable weapons, even though they didn't pack as much of a punch. I balanced this with strong temporary weapons that I could restore when I needed more oomph during boss fights or when I came up against particularly strong regular enemies in my travels. There are also some long-range attack options in the form of magic at your disposal. If you play smartly, you'll have virtually unlimited use of MP since it constantly regenerates. If you take your time exploring and don't charge foe after foe, you should always have enough magic to head off encounters without running out. You can also use magic restoring potions in a pinch if you need them. Going back to prices of things for a moment, magic spells are heinously expensive. If I didn't find a spell while exploring, I did without it. One of the only types of magic that you do find is fire, and it quickly became my go-to strategy for most encounters. It has the benefit of being a great distance attack, but it is limited in the kinds of enemies that are affected by it. I'm sure that there were some other great magic spells available, but I wasn't willing to break the bank to find out. Under all the layers of dungeon crawling, Brandish is an RPG with stat management and an experience system. It is unconventional in a few ways because the only things that increase with a new level are HP and MP. The remaining values are improved through battle actions. To raise defense strength, you have to take physical damage. To increase magic offense, you have to attack enemies with magic. I'm sure you get the point, but this can cramp your playstyle a bit. For someone like me who plays more defensively with magic at a distance, I didn't take on as much physical damage as someone who might prefer to play at closer range. I don't want to give too much away here, but I will say that playing my own way and not becoming well-rounded with all stats came back to bite me at the end of the game. I had a severely underleveled stat that caused me to be instantaneously killed trying to face off with the final boss, and there's nothing more frustrating than having to grind up when you're so close to the end. The good thing is that, yes, you can grind out your stats by finding a safe way to get beat up a bunch in various ways, but other than the Dark Zone nonsense I mentioned earlier, this was my other big complaint that I just didn't see coming until it was far too late to do anything about it. Brandish has very quickly become one of my favorite games for the Super Nintendo, and it's a shame that it gets pushed aside because of the control scheme and other rumors about its reputation. While it might seem a bit dry compared to the intense and quick action of other dungeon-centric games, it does have an addictive quality to it that keeps you hooked. You'll want to see what's up the next staircase, behind the next wall, or down one of the many pits. It's certainly not perfect, but it has a ton of character in its storytelling and an interesting and distinct experience system that sets it apart from other similar adventures. There's even a couple of different endings up for grabs for anyone that enjoys a good dose of replay value, so before you turn this one away, change up that control scheme and go on one of the wildest walks that the Super Nintendo has to offer.